Hi, I want to tell you about how I use stimulants in the form of caffeine specifically as a neurodivergent person with autism and ADHD, as well as CPTSD, specifically with the purpose of overcoming some moments in my life when overwhelm and dysregulation get the better of me. And I'd like to preface this by saying that I also make use of caffeine for certain other objectives, such as when I have some creative or social goals to take care of, and those processes are a little bit different than what I'm about to tell you about, but there is that as well. So caffeine specifically comes in a few forms, the most common being coffee, tea, and there are actually several types of tea, and different people respond to different kinds of teas a bit different, and chocolate. This is a non-exhaustive list, and it is here to make the point that the form in which you take your caffeine will give you different results as you metabolize it, and this will vary from person to person regardless of their neurological status. Just as an example, there are people who would drink coffee all day but get extremely jittery and have unpleasant heart palpitations from taking a matcha tea, for example. And then for other people, the opposite might be true. Moving on, I'm not going to be going into all of the effects that caffeine has on the human body and everything that happens as it is metabolized. There are plenty of people who have explained it very well, even here on YouTube, and you can look it up very easily. But I would like to explore how caffeine can both cause and help with dysregulation and overwhelm for a neurodivergent person such as myself. So caffeine is a stimulant, and as a stimulant it makes things inside the body, mind and psyche start to happen more quickly than they naturally would at that particular point in time, given whatever balance the body is in. And so as it kicks you into this overdrive mode, your stress levels also obviously increase. So that's the first part of the equation. For a neurodivergent person, stress levels are a big thing. The higher the stress levels, the more quicker overwhelm happens. So caffeine can be a great contributor to a lot of overwhelm and more frequent autistic meltdowns, for example. That being said, individual sensitivity to caffeine is also a thing, and I believe it varies even for neurodivergent individuals. However, my personal experience is that I am highly, highly sensitive to caffeine, and sometimes I really need to completely stay away from it, and even a tiny bit can just throw everything off balance for me. Then again, I am here to explain that I do partake in it, and as I do so, I am usually very conscious of the kind of balance and state that I'm in, so I can choose to take caffeine in the form and amount that I find myself needing at a particular time, or just keep myself accountable for the possible dysregulation that I'm about to inflict on myself. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, if you get the reference. And so, this is how it works. When I am in a stressful time and I feel myself quite dysregulated often, I take caffeine, usually in the form of either black tea or some forms of green tea. Very rarely coffee, since coffee is the most dysregulating form for me. And so this intake of caffeine works in two ways. First, it actually helps me overcome whatever stressful things are going on and maybe get some tasks done and resolved. So that's what most people would take caffeine for anyway, to kind of kickstart their activeness in the world, and see that works for a bit. But depending on my level of dysregulation and overwhelm, it might actually work well and I would get a few things done. However, it might not even get me through one large task if I'm in a particular state. And there's no telling. So in this first phase, I can either be quite glad for everything I was able to resolve, or it can just hit the fiasco place quite quickly, which it's important to not get upset about while being very upset. And so here's what I actually wanted to share after this really long introduction. That would be the second phase, right, of this caffeinated journey. Like I said, initially there was already some dysregulation and overwhelm going on that was not being resolved. And taking caffeine at first is directed at resolving current tasks, which might be seeming too difficult to undertake because of this already existing overwhelm. Then you might or might not get through some of those tasks. You might or might not hit a meltdown point as a result of this overstimulation. And what I do here, and this is often even the next day or a couple of days later, I take more caffeine. I take more caffeine and I take some time to myself. Usually this does take some time for me personally. So from the initial beginnings of an overwhelm all the way through trying to knock a bunch of tasks off of my to-do list or get through whatever emergency is happening. So as days go by, not too many days, this is usually within about a maximum of 3 or 4 days, but probably less, probably about 2 days. As I take caffeine each day and then spend time with myself, the overstimulation going on in my system finally reaches a point where it is able to access the initial overwhelm that was brewing. And most often, the initial overwhelm that was brewing is going to be unprocessed emotions coming from places in my neurodivergent being that are inaccessible to me on the conscious level. So this also goes back to a certain level of alexithymia that I'm dealing with and that many neurodivergent people deal with, which is why I'm explaining this process of mine, because I think this could actually be helpful to some other neurodivergent folks. And so this is a way that I access the emotional pressure that sits at the core of an overwhelmed state that isn't regulating itself for a while because it just wouldn't come to the surface. And if I stay mindful enough, the resolution that comes, which often comes in the form of tears, but it can also come in the form of other emotional releases. There could be anger, for example, or something like that. It wouldn't necessarily actually come with something conscious as the reason. So again, I would end up accessing my emotional states while not quite linking them to their source, to why they're there in the first place. And it would be great if we could process all of our emotions consciously, but for some of us that's just not how it works generally. However, if they come out, they're out. And right after they're out, you can either be dysregulated from having an emotion that's not properly linked up to your conscious mind, or, and this bit took me personally a while to practice and get the hang of, but it's brilliant. I totally recommend it. I've nearly stopped having meltdowns once I got the hang of it. I have these smaller emotional releases instead. So once you have an emotion come up for you, through you rather, despite your usual state and brain attempting to suppress it and being unable to consciously process it, that's actually probably why it's being suppressed in the first place. And so, like in this example, the caffeine helps to lift those suppression mechanisms. Once the emotion is out, you want to kind of center yourself, or rather just turn your awareness onto yourself and consciously just tell yourself that, well, that was an emotional release. If it was crying, for example, you would tell yourself, well, I was just now clearly upset about something, and I was clearly upset about it for a long time because I could feel it brewing and having this pressure for days on end. If it was perhaps, as just one alternative example, some anger coming up, and you felt you needed to just scream out into space, at this point you would then tell yourself, okay, I was very, very angry about something, and even if I don't know what that was my emotion, and that's okay, and this emotion is now finished. Provided that it is finished, perhaps you want to scream some more. As I was saying, if you are at this point remaining consciously in this awareness of yourself expressing an emotion, rather than necessarily needing to know the details, which you are not being able to access, or perhaps some details do come for you, but usually not. So, like the reasons for the emotions, or just context, or needing to build it into your internal story about what is happening in your life and to you right now, just getting the hang of allowing that emotion to come up in a physical form and be okay with that, and then immediately be done with that. While that takes some practice, like I already mentioned, this has significantly cut down my frequency of meltdowns. So essentially this is a kind of roundabout way of accessing and processing emotions, which are still going on inside a neurodivergent body, even if the only way that this neurodivergent body is able to interact with them is through just feeling this building pressure all of the time and not really knowing what to do about it except break down and melt down. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening.